It is rare, but there are occasions where you find that YouTube does not provide an instructional video. This seems to be one of those cases, so I'm going to try and fix that. What you're looking at is the passenger side tail lamp on my 2021 Chevy Bolt EV. Unfortunately, due to circumstances that I'm still not quite clear on, the lamp ended up getting dinged up. Being the DIY kind of person that I am, I went and bought one online from GM and I'm going to show you what is required to replace it. Okay, and then just to summarize the tools I think you need for this, I mentioned before I used a bicycle tire lever, which is plastic, to get the trim started coming off. I have my 1/4 inch ratchet. I use the long extension. It's an 8mm for all the nuts, and a T15 Torx for that one bolt that goes in the handhold. It is good to have one of these trim panel removers, and I did use this little screwdriver more to position things than anything else. I didn't show it here, but I did use some needle nose pliers when I was having trouble getting the bolts back in, and then a very low value 1/4 inch drive torque wrench to set those nuts to 4 Newton meters. So those are the tools that I ended up using. As I mentioned, I ended up having to take off the lower piece of trim on the inside of the hatch to do this. And again, it's kind of instructive to be able to look at this and see which plastic pieces you have to pop out. You'll see there are 8 plastic retainers. They're the little yellow things you see, and they can all be pried out. The last little trick you have to go through is that there is a slot up at the top here that attaches it to the second piece of trim. There appear to be 2 small trim side pieces that join the top and the bottom. If you push this around a little bit and wiggle it, it's pretty easy to get that apart, and then you can take the whole thing off. That makes it a lot more accessible. But again, I think the thing to know is that you've got 8 of these things that you have to pop loose. I started by putting a plastic tire lever underneath the bottom here. There is a single Torx head bolt in the holder, the door handle part in it that you need to take out first. I forgot to mention that, but that comes out first. Then you pop the 8 here. But this is the new part, which comes very nicely packaged, and it's actually must be fairly sophisticated because there's a $50 core charge on it. So I do want to get the old one back. But looking at the new one, these 3 bolts, which are 8mm nuts, are clearly visible on the inside. They're not covered by trim. The problematic one is this one right here, which is covered by the trim. So you can get to this without having to fully remove the trim, but I did end up completely taking the trim off in order to be able to figure out the connector, which I'll explain to you how that works as well. But again, all you really need to do to get this thing off, fortunately, is to get 4 8mm nuts off of these threads, and the thing pulls out seemingly without any other disassembly. Okay, so what you're looking at now is the inside of the hatch. The hatch is up. Here is the latch. And then over here on the passenger side, here are the 3 bolts. I've already taken the 8mm nuts off. These are visible. They're covered with a little triangular shaped plastic part that you take off that's just decorative. And then there's an 8mm bolt that you unscrew. Then the 4th one that you have to get to is right here. Don't be confused by this round thing here. This is just a locating pin, but once you get access to that and unscrew it, this should come out. The other part, which can be kind of confusing, and if you know how to do this, you might be able to do this without having to take the trim all the way off, is the connector, which, as most modern connectors are, has a fail-safe mechanism. So when you take it off, it's going to look like that with this little red tab pushed up into it. You have to pull the tab down to unlock it. Then You push in the center here right above the red tab. He said, hopefully. Yeah, it's kind of difficult to see where it is, but you have to kind of get your finger in there, and then you push down that little center part right there to get it to release. So once you have that, that's out. So now it is completely unfastened from the hatch, and so I'm going to take it out and replace it with the new one. Okay, so there's the old one out and the new one before I've put it back in. I did really realize on trying to remove it that there was a little bit more effort required than I expected. And I've found out that the reason for that, and I'll show you on the new one, is that there are these tabs here and here that are catch on the inside of the opening. And so you either need to do what I did, which is I ended up just kind of forcing it, or you're going to have to somehow squeeze those together or push one of them down, which will let it out. It's not impossible to kind of force out, which is what I did by wiggling it, but it did initially confuse me because I thought there was a little bit more force required than necessary, which always makes me nervous. But it's out. I did not break any of the tabs, so the core should be good. It's a little dirty, but now I'm going to take off the protective wrap and put this new one in, and I'll show you how to reassemble it. All right, so I've cleaned up the cavity a bit. There are a lot of unpaved roads around here, and so there's quite a bit of dust in there. Now I am going to place the new headlamp. There we go. I'm trying to do this with one hand while I film it, into the cavity, and it should be pretty easily located. He said trying to do it with one hand in the cavity by those screw holes and that bolt. Well, I'm gonna stop so I don't drop this and want to kill myself for having damaged a $400 Taillight. So I'll show you once it's in. Okay, so there it is in the cavity. It was pretty easy to get in there once I was using two hands. Again, we have the 3 screws there that hold it on, the other screw with the locating pin there, and there are those 2 tabs in here around the connector that I had to pop in so that it is held in there. So now all I'm going to have to do is reconnect the connector, push it all the way in until it clicks, then push the red security button up into it, and now that's in there just fine. So now we just start the screws here. So this is the nut, one of the nuts that goes on here. They have a captive washer on them. So we get those all finger tight in there. Pardon all the camera movement. As I said, this is all being done by one person and 2 hands. Okay, so those are all finger tight. Now I'm going to get the 4th one, which goes on the interior here next to the locating pin. Get that in there. All right. So I don't have a torque spec on these. Probably going to go to just a few foot-pounds on these because they are not very large. So I'm going to torque those down, and then I'll show you the reassembly of the trim on the inside. Okay, so there it is with the tail lamp installed. Of course, before I went to the trouble of putting the trim on, I wanted to check and make sure it was working. And indeed it is. The lights are on and it matches exactly the left one, perhaps a little bit brighter, but that sort of establishes that I apparently have installed it correctly. Okay, so once again, here is the trim I'm installing. I am going to start by attaching it to the upper trim here. This tab, as I said before, has to go through that little slot that I showed before. And there is also, there are some parts right here that fit over the lip on this cover here. So those need to go on first, and then I'm going to lever it on from the bottom, hopefully popping all of the connectors back into these 8 holes that they go into. Again, because I'm doing this solo, I'm going to have to do this and then show it to you after I get it in. I'll warn you about any major difficulties I have along the way. Okay, so I've got it partway back on. So I've reconnected the intermediate trim piece to the bottom trim piece. So those are mostly in. That tab is mostly in the slot. The next difficult part was you have to kind of pull out on this a bit to get it to go over the hood latch. But with that in, hopefully I'm just going to be pushing on the surface of this to get all of those push fit connectors to go into their proper place. All right, so it's back on and it fits pretty well. I wish I could tell you that that all happened in a few seconds and that it just all popped right back in there, but I managed to get 2 of the connectors misaligned and had to spend about 10 minutes playing around with a pair of needle nose pliers to get them realigned and in their seating holes, but they're now seated in there and it is all back in. Now, I mentioned before that you need to put in a little Torx bolt that goes into the handhold here, and that will be the end of the reassembly and should be done. Okay, so that little, I think it's a T15 Torx is in there, and now all the fasteners are in. All of this is pretty much as well aligned as it ever was. It is a Chevy Bolt after all, so some of the clearances are not exactly Audi class, but it's all back together. I do love this car. Oh, one other thing is I mentioned there are little covers that go on these exposed bolts. They are just little plastic things that you screw on or push on to cover those up as a decorative thing, and so you don't end up catching something on those exposed threads there. So with that back on there, I think we are complete. Yeah, those just screw on there a little loosely. To cover those up. So, all right, so we have successfully replaced. Make sure those don't fall off. I did not use a Torx spec on that. That's just snug. It goes into a metal clip. So we're all good there. And can shut it. Verify that it shuts correctly. The new tail lamp, as I showed before, works. And the tailgate functions normally. So I think we're going to call this job done. And I hope that this will help somebody else who has to do this get it done with a slightly less amount of struggle than I had.